Good afternoon and welcome. I am Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we are an independent charity established in 1985 to increase diversity of thought on issues related to the economy and Scottish public policy. A link to the website of the David Hume Institute is in the Zoom chat if you'd like to find out more about our work. Now, just before we get started, there are a few things about how the event will run. We're recording the session so that it can be uploaded to the website afterwards. And as I welcome everyone, please do use the chat function to introduce yourselves and connect with others, for example, through sharing a link to your LinkedIn profile. We've added this today as one of the feedbacks in our recent survey showed that people wanted more chance to see who was in the room with them. There'll be approximately 15 minutes of panel conversation before we move into questions from the audience. And for the questions, if you can post them in the Q&A section, and then we'll invite you to unmute so you can ask the questions in your own word directly to the panelists. When asking your question, please can you state your name and if applicable, your organisation. And if you're unable to unmute, then let us know and we'll ask the question for you. As we near the end of the event, I may group questions to try to get through as many as possible. So without further ado, because we've got so much to discuss today, we welcome our speakers to discuss what can political philosophy tell us about how to rebuild society after the pandemic. Now, COVID has fundamentally changed how people connect with the places in which they live, work and play, and with how they connect to each other. It has exacerbated stark inequalities so that those with resources have been able to consolidate, while those without, often in insecure employment and with little, if any, personal reserves, see increased risks and costs. The need to rebuild the economy and society in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis gives us a unique opportunity to re-examine and perhaps reinvent how we think about society. Last year, the David Hume Institute listened to over 5,000 people to hear their thoughts on actions that would take Scotland further and faster towards a country that is prosperous, sustainable, inclusive and fair. So when we heard about this new book, we thought what better way to finish our events for this year than with some more food for thought about how we build forward better. So the hashtag for today's event is Build Forward Better. Today, we will consider what the relationship is between crisis and opportunity, and how do we seize the moment in order for good to come from all the heartache. Put simply, where do we go from here? Joining me today are Dr. Aveek Bhattacharya, Chief Economist with the Social Market Foundation, Professor Rowan Crufts from the University of Stirling, and Dr. Diana Popescu from the University of Edinburgh, to discuss their work and the ethics of our response to the pandemic and to a significantly changed and increasingly unequal society. Here we are for a really lively discussion ahead of us. Now, over to Aveek. Please kick us off by telling us about your work on political philosophy and what we can learn from the pandemic.
Sure thing. So this, the book, Political Philosophy in a Pandemic, that we're here to discuss today, basically comes out of a blog called Justice Everywhere that I helped to edit with my co-editor, Faye Nyker. And basically, the mission of Justice Everywhere is to try and get political philosophers to think about and write about in an accessible manner, kind of things that are happening in the world around them, to kind of relate the stuff that is happening in political philosophy seminar rooms to the real world around us. And so in those kind of first few months of COVID in spring of 2020, Faye and I kind of looked around us. We saw various kind of researchers and experts of different types taking the tools of their trade, looking at whether it's economists or mathematical modelers, or obviously epidemiologists and public health experts, taking the various kind of things that they knew and trying to apply it to this kind of novel phenomenon that was kind of uprooting our lives. And so we thought, what do political philosophers have to contribute? And so what we did is we gathered together a selection of kind of contributors to the blog, different political philosophers, got them to write very short pieces on different aspects of the pandemic and how they relate to political philosophy. And basically that was very kind of interesting. We felt that that was just kind of the very start of the conversation, and so we decided to build that out. We got a few more people on board. We got them to kind of think about it a bit more deeply and to expand upon the thoughts they put on the blog. And what we've ended up with is a book with 20 chapters looking at different aspects, looking at the kind of economic justice, social welfare and inclusion, what democracy means and how we build it back kind of in the future, speech and misinformation, and the relationship between crisis and political opportunity. And when we first kind of embarked upon the book, we were a little bit concerned because we're worried that we're starting to write this book in the summer of 2020. We don't know what the world is going to look like in 2021 when it comes out. Is this all going to be passé? Are we going to have missed our moment? And actually, it turns out that I think that it's coming out at a very good moment. I don't know if we can talk about being kind of beyond COVID or building back, or how far kind of if we're at the middle or at the end, but we are certainly at a moment where we're starting to think about what comes next, basically, and kind of the most acute kind of crisis phase. The chaos of those early months certainly has passed, when all we were doing was kind of surviving from moment to moment in a policy sense. And in fact, most of the things that people wanted to write about were not about responding to the acute emergency. They were about thinking about what the world looks like in a broader sense moving forward. So I'm going to leave it there, but I think Susan's teed up the conversation quite well in terms of really the theme is that, or one of the kind of main themes emerging from the book is that there is this kind of narrow window of opportunity where, for various reasons, possibilities seem expanded, where the problems in our society have been kind of brought to light. And it seems like right now is a moment that might be passing to really kind of grasp those issues, to take advantage of the political will in the sense of political possibility. And Rowan and Diana's kind of contributions in different ways kind of speak to that. So yeah, I'll let them speak to give you a flavour of some of the ideas that are in the book.
Thanks, Aveek. So Rowan, do you want to switch your camera on and give us an insight into your research?
Yep, no, great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Let me just find what I wanted to say. So yes, thanks so much for inviting me. And thanks to Aveek also for inviting me to contribute to the book along with Faye. I mean, there's so much in this book, Political Philosophy in a Pandemic. There's interesting work on the nature of the family, on our need for social interaction, on what counts as good housing, on how disadvantages in one area of life feed into disadvantages elsewhere. And you asked me to say a little bit about my own contribution, which took its cue from how, in a democracy, our policies should be responsive to people's support for them. And I guess my general question that I thought about in the chapter was, there are lots of debates about the pandemic, about whether to lock down, whether to close schools, whether to make vaccination or face masks compulsory. And in these debates, my question was, who should we listen to and what weight should we give to the different voices? And I start from the principle that normally people's support for a policy is a reason in its favour. And in particular, people's support for a policy helps legitimate it, where this means it helps it make it morally acceptable to enforce the policy. And people, I just mean those who are affected, who live in the relevant territory. And I think there are two grounds for this principle that the people's support for a policy can help legitimate it. One is that support signals some kind of consent, and consent can help legitimate a policy. It can't always, it depends what you're consenting to, but it can sometimes. Secondly, people's support for a policy also suggests that the policy reflects people's knowledge about what matters. And I think when it comes to the kind of fundamental values at stake in political decisions, such as the relative importance of health and freedom, I think knowledge lies with the people, and lived expertise is dispersed broadly among everyone. So I just want to say a bit more about that. I mean, I'm not denying that there's really important technical expert knowledge out there in healthcare about, and this should feed into decision-making, expertise about the effects of vaccines and not lockdowns. But even if we know that a lockdown will save X many lives, we still need to weigh up the human cost of the lives saved against the freedom restricted. And on this point about sort of general fundamental questions like how far you weigh human life against the freedom of other people or your own freedom against your own chance of continuing to live, I think we can only really look to the accumulated wisdom of everyone living their lives. So we need to listen to those who know what it's like to have loved ones die in hospital, to have children at home while trying to work full time, for example. And this kind of expertise, I think, is dispersed amongst us. So listening to what people support is important in order to make political decisions well informed. So in the chapter, I'll say a tiny bit more, and then we can move on. But in the chapter, having outlined this general principle that policies in a democracy gain legitimacy from people's support, I then go on to think about specific cases where this principle actually doesn't hold. I argue that when someone proposes a policy disingenuously, hoping that others will respect it while they intend to violate it themselves, then their support, the support of those who aren't intending to respect it, doesn't confer legitimacy on the policy's imposition. And we do sometimes get this sense of people come up with a policy for them, thinking that's never going to apply to me, I'm never going to have to respect that. And the fact that these people support the policy doesn't confer much legitimacy on the imposition of the policy. Similarly, I argue that when someone proposes a policy because they intend to benefit from the policy's unjust elements, again, their support doesn't confer legitimacy on the policy's imposition. And I think these points have implications for how we should think about some of the arguments made during the pandemic. And to put it very roughly, if a return to business as usual and an end to lockdowns is favoured and supported mainly by those who will benefit from the injustices of business as usual, this gives us less reason to listen to such arguments for returning to business as usual than if business as usual is also advocated by those who are going to be put at risk by it. And in the chapter, I look at how this relates to school closures. And school closures harm children educationally. They also harm children who are disadvantaged in terms of housing, childcare, and access to food. And they also, of course, present huge challenges for parents and for employers. And in my view, the poor housing and food that some children suffer due to school closures is a sort of independent injustice. It was unjust even before the pandemic, when the schools were open. And now, if people in privileged positions ask for schools to be reopened mainly as a sort of sticking plaster for these wider social injustices, and if they don't support or they actively oppose further measures to address these injustices, then this seems to me to be a case where you've got some people proposing an unjust policy from which they're going to benefit. And in these sorts of cases, the voices requesting school reopening without campaigning against the wider injustices, I think they do less to legitimate the policy of reopening than the voices of those who will suffer from the injustices and the voices of those who are going to campaign against the injustices. So I guess I'm saying whose voice speaks does count in working out what can legitimate this policy. But just to end, I'm not denying that excellent policies can be proposed by people who stand to benefit from their injustices. So I was thinking, suppose, for example, suppose the creators of Zoom were the main advocates of a lockdown. The lockdown might still be a great idea because for health reasons, might need a lockdown. But the particular support you get from the creators of Zoom, given their position, does much less to legitimate the lockdown policy than support by the wider population and by healthcare professionals. And my point can be seen as one of many possible departures from the utilitarian view that a policy's serving well-being confers legitimacy on it wherever that well-being is located. Instead, I want to say that whose well-being or choices at stake matters enormously. So that's my little summary of my chapter. And obviously there are many other things to discuss too. I'm hoping we can talk about more of them as this continues. Thanks.
Oh, fantastic. There's so much food for thought in there. I have so many questions already. So if you are thinking of questions, please do put them in the chat or in the Q&A function, because you'll need to get in quickly before me. Diana, would you give us a summary of your chapter next, and then we'll open it out and I'll start firing my questions for discussion at you both.
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be part of this book, and now to be able to speak about it with one of the editors and fellow contributors. And what attracted me most about the book was that it's not one of those philosophical projects in which we take some concepts that have already been developed by certain philosophers and then we apply them to the new reality. but rather we think through some of the issues that are raised by the pandemic and think through what solving them might mean for the future. So I think the book is already framed as a sort of realistic utopia in which we start from the situation as it is, and it's an imperfect situation, and then we try to make that situation better through certain through certain theories that we're trying to develop. And that notion of a realistic utopia is the one that was coined by Philip van Parijs, who is the author who made the concept of universal basic income particularly prominent in the philosophical literature. And that was my contribution to this volume, to demonstrate that the current pandemic bolsters the case for a universal basic income. And my chapter focused a lot on how the current pandemic has strengthened the case for social solidarity as opposed to individual responsibility. And this is important for how we think about the welfare state, or more generally, the justifications behind extending welfare protections to certain people. And since the 1990s, we have seen a model of welfare provision that was based on the notion of individual responsibility, in which if recipients fail to demonstrate individual responsibility, we would even take measures away from them. But the older justification for introducing welfare measures in the first place, the one that happened after the Second World War, was in terms of social solidarity. So that's what makes this pandemic particularly interesting from the point of view of universal basic income, that you have a sense of social solidarity forming. And that sense of social solidarity is a very good starting point for expanding welfare provisions from where they are now, when they are quite means-tested, to the universal unconditional type of provision that is a universal basic income. And in the chapter, I focused a lot on the kind of political discourses that we see around the pandemic, the discourse of all being in the same boat, Rishi Sunak coming forward saying to different categories, you have not been forgotten, we'll extend the furlough to you as well, on the economic side, but also the medical argument for wearing masks has been formulated in altruistic terms, in which it's not so much your own protection that is being put forward as an argument for wearing masks, but protecting others. So this kind of shift from the individual to the collective demonstrates a discourse of solidarity, which again can bolster the case for universal basic income. And there have been some developments since writing the chapter, and I thought I would be more pessimistic, because at the start of the pandemic, there were discourses about universal basic income in Scotland, in Spain. The Pope was advocating for it, and now we see less of that. But we do see a discourse of solidarity expanding in other areas as well. So in terms of where we are since having written the chapter last year to now, there is reason to be optimistic or pessimistic. And one of the things I've noticed from the point of view of solidarity is that it's not just the argument for wearing masks that was formulated in terms of solidarity, but more and more even arguments for keeping things open. So maybe cutting down restrictions are formulated not in terms of, oh, I would really like to go to the pub, but rather how would increased restrictions affect the hospitality industry? What about the mental health of young people, and so on and so forth? So for me, the fact that even the argument against, for instance, mask wearing is formulated not in terms of individual benefits, but in terms of how the lives of others would be affected, is a good sign in terms of how we think about solidarity. And generally speaking, we think about how others' lives were upended the same or even worse than ours. When we think about the effects of the pandemic, we don't have the same individualistic outlook as before in mainstream discourses. And another thing that would make universal basic income necessary going forward is that, sadly, one of the upshots of the pandemic has been a mental health epidemic. And imagine what it would be for welfare benefits that are very necessary for people whose mental health was affected to be conditioned by demonstrating that these people who suffer from mental health issues are to this extent or this other extent fit for work, and checking them all the time. So the case for universal basic income, I would say, has become even stronger in light of the aftermath of the pandemic. So this is what I'd like to leave you with, just to think through this issue of solidarity and how it might impact economic arguments for what people are entitled to, and think about what kind of reasonable hopes there are. Because even though the book is called Political Philosophy in a Pandemic, Routes to a More Just Future, I think an equally valid subtitle would be Reasonable Hopes for the future. I think that's what we try to do in the book. So thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to it.
Thank you, Diana. Aveek and Rowan, do you want to put your cameras back on, and we'll all imagine that we were sitting beside a fire with perhaps a cup of tea or something stronger, and a nice big sofa or armchair to sink into rather than on a Zoom. And once you've got that image in your head, then I'll chuck some questions at you. So the thing that for me in my head, I loved the book because it was so easy to read, because they were sort of short essays, and I was thinking, oh, this is going to be heavy, but actually I whizzed through it because it brought together so many things that I'd been kind of thinking about a little bit, or maybe some things that I'd seen that I was uncomfortable about. So when Rowan was saying who was arguing for the opening up of schools, that shot home, because there were a few voices in Scotland, and I was kind of thinking, it's interesting to know they're not the ones that are most affected arguing for that. So it did bring home some research I read a little while ago about intergenerational conflicts, and I think that for me connects both Diana and Rowan's areas, in that there's research that shows it looked at, are you better being born as part of a big birth cohort like the baby boomers, or are you better being born a small cohort? And the gist of that research was that actually you're better being a baby boomer because there's more voices to argue for the things that you want. And that came through really strongly in the pandemic, I think. Well, that's my question to you. Does it come through strongly in what you're thinking about, and who should we listen to? Is it those that shout loudest, or the ones that vote, that get their voices heard and get the policies that suit their needs? So over to you. What do you think of that?
I was going to just speak. I don't mind who speaks. No, I think I was going to say, I just think that's really, really interesting, that thought about which generation you're born into, whether the numbers matter, because you'll have a bigger voice. I mean, I think something I'm wary, sometimes, this isn't quite to address this, but something I'm wary of that you sometimes encounter is an argument which says that as you get older, your voice counts for less because you have potentially fewer years ahead of you than the people who are younger and have their whole life ahead of them. I don't know why. I'm just rather, I'm a little bit wary of that. That sort of suggests there's a fixed lifespan we should all be sort of working evenly within. But I did feel that there was a bit of a generational conflict here, and maybe it's also, I mean, it struck me, as a parent, I was struck by the fact that that when the schools did open up, almost everyone I know has got COVID. Everyone I know who's a parent has at some point had COVID, despite being double vaccinated, and that was another of those issues that I felt was never explicitly raised. That sense of, if you've got children at school, this policy is going to result in you catching COVID at some point. I think none of this is really to address your point, but just extra observations on it.
I mean, that came through really strongly for us in one of the conversations we had with a young carers service. Had a lot more carers referred to it because they were now caring for parents that had long-term conditions as a result of having COVID, and that no one talks about that as in the question whether or not we should open schools, and those young people are going to have their lives affected for a long time. And Diana, do you find there's an age manifestation, as in who's in favor of universal basic income or more solidarity in terms of support?
Well, we definitely see younger voters supporting candidates who are in favor of universal basic income. And it's seen as a progressive measure, and we know that the young people typically tend to put their weight behind these kinds of measures. But it could also be that they are more impacted by the kind of issues that universal basic income has to could solve. They are more impacted by anxiety towards the future. They might suffer from more serious mental health conditions, especially now as a result of the pandemic. And universal basic income would be a policy that would help with that. So it could be a self-interested policy, but it could also be, just the fact that it's a progressive cause that young people put their weight behind. But to answer the question, I would say that there's definitely a trend that you can see among young people supporting UBI.
Thanks, Diana. Aveek, do you want to come in on this before we open up to audience questions?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I think you put your finger on one of the kind of key themes coming out of the book, I think, and that's going to probably cast a bit of shadow over our politics for the years to come, which is intergenerational conflict. And in many ways, kind of the structure of the thing we're grappling with in relation to COVID, which is a virus which obviously can have quite significant health harms for younger people, particularly with disadvantage, but on a probabilistic basis is more likely to do kind of damage to older people. That's where kind of more of the health harm has been. And measures that were economically disadvantaging younger people who are on the kind of fringes of the labour market, who are more likely to be put on furlough, more likely to see their incomes go down. And at the same time, we see house prices go up, and we know who benefits from that. It's like taking these fissures that we have in our society and just like pulling them apart. And David Yarrow's contribution, which talks about this question of who should pay for the COVID debts, and there's been a bit of discussion about this shouldn't be put on the shoulders of young people. And if you want to talk about putting our fingers in the fissures, then look at the way that look at what's happening with tuition fees in England. Sorry, no, it's an England-focused thing, but look what's happened with national insurance and who pays that, and the social care levy. In loads of ways, the generational divide is being kind of that's being kind of made worse in lots of ways. But I think it's interesting that actually politically there isn't that much intergenerational hostility. I think we still do have the solidarity that Deanna's talking about is still very strong, and I think that kind of was the dominant response, even though people have got a lot of reasons to be quite cheesed off. The way that it is manifesting is not necessarily in an intergenerational warfare. And so there are the kind of resources there for the solidarity that I think Deanna wants to kind of foster and build on. But you've got to kind of avoid the material things getting worse, I think, to keep that going.
So we have a question from Jamie Kerr on social solidarity. So should we go to that one first, and then we'll go to Ava second? Jamie, are you able to unmute and ask a question in person?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
I find the furlough scheme really interesting, that businesses are supported during the tough times, and I wonder if there's views more broadly as to how that's paid back, as it were, and along the lines of social solidarity. So France had their exceptional wealth tax after the Second World War. Or I wonder if I'm completely wrong in viewing furlough as support for businesses, and instead it was a support for individuals and families merely administered through businesses. But more in the context of social solidarity, how do we ensure the model changes, that the public picks up the risk, but none of the rewards, as it were?
Thanks, Jamie. I'll add in another to that's fascinated me, which is the branding of furlough. The fact that it was chosen to be something completely separate from universal credit, and it's still socially acceptable that people are on furlough, whereas people seem to look down a bit on people that are on universal credit, but essentially they're both support from the state. So I'll throw that in too, because I think that's another thing. The other question, to compound that, because there's three of you, so I have to give you three different issues slightly. I'm really interested in the change that's happened with a number of people contracting that were self-employed who were then paying lower rates of national insurance or taking pay through directors' income, but were very upset when they weren't given the same level of support as others and made their voices heard very loudly. And that idea that there's social solidarity when we need it, like, so when you need help, you want it out the system, but there isn't before that when you don't need it. And I wonder if that's something that we can cover today as well. So over to you three. I'll let you bounce off each other.
Can I start? All right, great. So first of all, Jamie, I couldn't agree with you more about how you interpreted furlough, but also about what the main problem is, which is how do we ensure that these gains keep in place. And you know, comparing the current situation to what happened after the Second World War, we see some parallels also in the sense that solidarity was formed in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and then it dwindled, which is why we have a discourse of solidarity in the 40s and 50s, and then in the 90s, we have a discourse of social responsibility. So in 40 years, that memory was lost. And the conditions that make solidarity so prevalent in our discourse now might change after the pandemic is over, not only because we won't be equally vulnerable to the virus as we are now, but also because in terms of what makes the furlough a good idea, it's this idea of an equal risk of losing your job. Because before the pandemic, a very wealthy, very well-to-do Broadway producer was not facing the same risk of losing their job as a delivery driver. But with the pandemic, we see this change in whose jobs are really essential and whose jobs we can do away with in the pandemic, such that the Broadway producer might be out of work, and there is this increased demand for delivery drivers. And in the period that's going to follow, when we have economic recovery, these roles might switch back. And all the reasons that made Broadway producers so wealthy in the first place might come back. So if we don't act now, the incentives are going to be lost. And the best thing that we can do is strike the iron while it's hot. Try to have new institutions in place based on the feelings that we now have, because those sentiments are going to go away. And this is something that a lot of people say about gains that we've had further back. For instance, the notion of social citizenship. Once you have that in place, it's going to create its own incentives. And I think that's the same with universal basic income. And that, once we have that in place, building on the current solidarity, then we're going to have more and more reasons to keep it in place. But I think you're absolutely right that there is a danger of just losing this moment.
Can I come in? Yeah, I think it's a really, really great question. And I think it would be really interesting. It's something I don't really know to be honest, whether this has changed kind of attitudes among businesses. Because whether or not you see furlough as support for businesses, there's been plenty of stuff around things like business rates, for example, that have clearly been quite targeted support for businesses. And it's interesting because I think in some ways the policy on business is moving a bit in the direction of solidarity, or expecting kind of more back from businesses in terms of, we've seen corporation tax has been very low in the UK, and that's slightly being increased, and or is planned to be increased. We'll see if we get that in the end. And in that case, maybe it's not the policy, but it's the framing. So you could see how that could be framed if Rishi Sunak stood up at the budget and said, I'm raising corporation tax because we've given this help and we expect kind of a contribution in return, and this is a kind of this should be seen as a solidarity payment. Actually, where I'm a bit concerned on the solidarity front is on individual personal taxes, where the policy discourse seems to be moving in quite a kind of, I'd say, quite a worrying direction. I think all this stuff about windfalls, we should be taxing away the windfalls for sure, and we should be kind of showing that we're all in it together. But a lot of the discourse around tax at the moment is, as we've seen with the national insurance tax, a lot of this is framing this as people are overtaxed, we can't bear it. And in general, there has been this political shift on the left towards the only people who need to be taxed are the 1% or the 5%. The 95% don't need to chip in. If we just get the billionaires and the millionaires, we'll be fine. which is not a solidaristic notion, which is not a risk-sharing notion, which isn't everyone pitching in. And so some things about the policy discourse concern me a bit.
Can I just add a tiny bit on that too? I really, I think I agree with what you've all been saying. I think Aveek's idea that the framing is important is really relevant. I actually thought your question, Jamie, sort of revealed how cleverly framed furlough is. We don't know if it's there to support businesses or individuals, because if you think it should be there to support businesses, you can think that. If you think it should be there to support individuals, you can think that. And I think that's partly because it doesn't change the status quo power relations. It takes the relations of power in the employment contract at that moment when the pandemic hit, and say we're just going to keep that going so you can keep your current relationship. So it does help people relative to what would have happened if they hadn't had help, but it doesn't represent any sort of radical change. And so I like Diana's thought that maybe we can kind of take the idea of solidarity that's sort of hidden within that, and the idea of fairness that I think has become more common, and think we can use that in future. Maybe there's a bit of me that's worried that nonetheless it sets that precedent of kind of keeping a pre-pandemic status quo going as the thing it's trying to do. So we've got to work with that while trying to move more solidaristically.
Thank you. So much to think about there, but I'm not going to come in with any more questions. Ava, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Of course. My question came in the middle of Rowan's talk, so it's probably a question for you. I was fascinated about the idea of legitimacy. I think legitimacy relies on people having access to reliable and trusted information. When the pandemic first hit, compliance with the lockdown measures was really quite high. I mean, there were individuals who didn't, but it was very different back then. And I think there is clearly some hesitance to do the same now, even if the figures say that some restrictions are needed, because, people are not in the same place. Compliance will not be as high now as it was in March last year. And I guess perhaps people's perception of what is trusted and what is reliable has waned. You get the independent sage being created. You have a unit in government created in order to tackle fake news. You have the rise of anti-vax material on social media. I wondered whether your chapter looks at that, or whether you have any more comments about that waning legitimacy.
Yeah, I thought it was a really great question. I saw it when it came in. Well, the chapter doesn't look at it. I could do a little bit of advertising. I've got a broader project called Norms for the New Public Sphere with Fabienne Peter in University of Warwick, and Natalie Ashton in Stirling, and Jonathan Hayward, who's an independent media industry person, where we're trying to think about these questions. Because I suppose my main answer is a sort of big yes to what you're saying, that once people either don't trust the information, or also if they just get it wrong, if there's massive misinformation out there and people have misunderstandings, then their consent or agreement to something so no longer, in a philosophical sense, does the same legitimating work. It's like agreeing to something where you don't know what you're agreeing to. If you agree to something and you understand what you're agreeing to and you know where you're going, then I think that can legitimate the imposition of force in going that way. If, as I think you see in parts of the US, we've got a very divided public sphere, we've got lots of people misled by prominent figures into believing things that aren't actually true, then the things you're thinking you're consenting to, they're not really going to be like that. And it's not going to be as safe as you think. And I just think that's a really big problem. And it's a problem about how we sort of integrate expertise and how we foster a sort of public debate where knowledge is supported in a way that doesn't at the same time divide people. Anyway, so yeah, that's, I suppose, just a big yes for you. I mean, my sense is things aren't quite so bad in Scotland or indeed the broader UK. I mean, I thought we had more confidence, more well-founded confidence in vaccines, and some less, and less mistrust. Of course, sometimes you want mistrust if it's well placed, but less wrongly placed mistrust in the UK. I don't know if that answers your question, but thanks.
I'm just gonna plug, if everyone's plugging a side project, I'm gonna plug a couple of chapters which relate to that. So we've got one from Rebecca Lowe, which talks about what is the state's duty of transparency during times of crisis, where she basically argues that we shouldn't relax our standards too much, if at all, in crisis. You can't get up to the minute kind of running commentary on everything that the government is doing, but the government should be clear about this stuff. It should tell you it's not telling you something, if that makes sense. We've got one on speech and misinformation by Jeff Howard, which argues that there's, on free speech grounds, we don't have to tolerate a lot of the misinformation that goes on social media, and we should be more demanding of social media in terms of protecting that space and limiting misinformation. So yeah, I'll just sorry,
Aveek, I could have been advertising the book. You're right. There's loads of stuff in the book.
Diana, I can see you wanting to come in, but there's another question in the Q&A still on legitimacy. So I'd quite like to take that at the same time, and then we'll come straight to Diana. Tom Ockenden, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, thank you. So my question is basically, how do you balance seeking legitimacy for policies within a country where people might see themselves as part of the same nation? So there might be more solidarity. How do you balance that with internationalist or global policy where people might not feel that same solidarity, but obviously the pandemic is a global event and things going on in other countries can really quickly impact in other countries. So how do you balance those two?
Thanks, Tom. Diana, are you okay to take that first?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think it's also a very difficult question, how you balance these things out. There's one, so I don't have a very good solution, unfortunately, but I can point you to a way to approach a solution that has been sadly neglected during the pandemic, which is to do a bit more public consultation, because we've had a discourse of just following the science, but the science doesn't speak as to how it should be applied, what should be prioritized. So there's been quite a little public consultation regarding that. And that's a space where you can have differences between the kind of decisions that are taken at the central level and the kind of decisions that would be more devolved and even at the not just national level, but very local level. You can have different citizens in a city, for instance, deciding how the rules should apply to them. So this is a model that hasn't been approached, and it should, but that only covers part of your question, because even at this very local level, you would still have potentially issues of people only being aware of how the situation affects them and not the global dimensions of the pandemic. But yeah, you could have this difference between the local and the central level, and hopefully the central level would be a bit more engaged in the global dimensions, and then we would deal with the local dimensions in this consultative forum. So that's a way towards a solution, but I just think it's a very great question.
Thanks. Aveek, Rowan. Oh, I can see Rowan's unmuted.
Well, Aveek, sorry, do you want to go? No, okay. No, I just wanted to say, because I think it's a really great question, and I think Diana's right that it's hard to work out how to answer it. There were two things I wanted to add to the question in a way. So one was that I think it's not just that the pandemic is itself a sort of global phenomenon, but I think it's also been accompanied by and supported a movement that was already happening, which was a sort of globalization of public political debates through social media, through the internet. Now we have at least I personally as an academic have loads of meetings where it's international. I can speak to someone in Ghana and someone in the USA on a meeting at the same time, and these sorts of things. And I know that might be those who have the privilege of having internet access, but there are many of us in that position, and it has globalized public debate. And I think my sense is that combined with the fact that the pandemic is also global sort of brings out a glitch in political philosophy, I would say, in the history of political philosophy. So I think political philosophy is still very statist. The kind of stuff I was doing about legitimacy was about the legitimacy of the use of force, where the idea is the force is the state that you are in. And of course, there are lots of transnational state organizations and intrastate sort of sub-organizations that don't get fully captured by that. So I don't have an answer, but maybe my suggestion is it's not only a practical question, it's actually a question that I think we need to address intellectually. We need to think a little bit about ideas of authority and legitimacy that are sort of nested within global models where the state isn't the only paradigm, would be my suggestion.
Can I take that on a wee bit? Because I've got a question for Deanna. Actually, I'd be interested to know what she thinks about it. So I think that's right at the institutional level, what Rowan said about political philosophy having neglected kind of the international. I think it's less kind of true in terms of distributive justice. There's a big debate about should we care about global inequalities? Why? What sort of principles should we have at a global level? And Deanna's work, part of what you're talking about UBI is more distributive questions, and your argument is about the pandemic has shown as a country we're so dependent on one another. What happens to the worst of us affects us all, so we have to have this solidarity. Now, I would say the same dynamic has been playing at a global level. Like, we're literally seeing this right now. What happens in South Africa is affecting us. And yet we don't seem to have got to that sort of solidarity at a global level. Do you have any thoughts on why that is, why the same dynamic has produced such different results, and also how that relates to how the global and national kind of interact on your distributive theories?
Yeah, that's another great question. There has been some literature about how focusing on a smaller setting, for instance, the nation state, can also bolster solidarity. So David Miller has written about that. So there is reason to believe that the smaller the setting, the stronger the bonds are, and the stronger the feeling of a shared fate. But it is puzzling that now that we share the same fate with the world, there's still vaccine nationalism, and it's of a kind that then comes back to bite us. So I guess that would speak more to not just the rational elements behind solidarity, but also the fact that there are some irrational elements that have to do with perhaps, bonds of kin and family and that kind of thing. So it's not all rational. So I agree that it should, if we follow this argument, we should definitely extend bonds of solidarity across borders, and perhaps that is happening at the level of individual people. It's just that governments don't act on it as much as they should. But it could also be that it's not just political theorists who adopt this framework of the nation state. It's something that we operate on. It's a sort of system one thinking. So that would be my best guess. But I also think it's a question for perhaps the empirical side of looking at people's motivation. So I was just speculating in good philosophical fashion.
Rowan, do you want to come in?
I was just agreeing. Sorry.
That's all right.
I suppose it did bring out the parallels, I suppose, with climate change as another, just thinking of COP26 and thinking how much global solidarity was shown by states there. Mm-hmm. Not much, I fear. But yeah.
But I think that was going to be my question next, although it's not anyone in the audience has asked it. But I do, when I read the book, I did feel really that COVID's just the start of an increased period of risk. And with climate change, we know those least able to cope with the impacts are the ones most likely to feel them. And all of the questions about individualism and collectivism are going to become really stark in the future, not just because of climate change, but we know we're going to have another COVID type. We know zoonotic diseases are going to increase, and our ability to cope with them is going to be more and more tricky. So mask wearing might become more normal in society. It might be something that we do much more often without thinking about it, even once COVID has gone past the crisis phase. But we're rapidly running through our time on today. I kind of want to make sure that we don't miss anything. So if I can ask the panelists to have a quick check through the questions that are there and see, there's another one on universal basic income. There is a one to do with children's education versus avoiding older adults, and the way that kind of takes us back to the earlier conversation about whose voices and whose harms and all those questions. So I will ponder all those, pose them, and give you all the kind of chance to say anything you've not said, but bring all together the bits that we've said so far so that we can finish the event on time. Diana's nodding most vigorously first, so I'm always going to go to you, Rachel, nodding keenness. So we'll do Diana, Rowan, and then finish with Aveek.
All right, nodding keenness on Zoom is the equivalent of scratching your head in a class and the teacher thinks you're raising your head. But that's good, because yes, one of the questions is on UBI. So I was keen to address that, especially since it offers me the opportunity to clarify an aspect of UBI that a lot of people might not be aware of, which is that not all proposals for universal basic income take the form of giving people an extra salary that's equivalent to the salary that they might get in paid employment. Even small sums of money that are given unconditionally to everyone count as universal basic income. And indeed, this is the model that we have in Alaska, the one that's the oldest running model in the world, in which communities in Alaska decided that if they were going to discover a natural resource, the dividends from that will be distributed equally to everyone, rather than, maybe the individual who owns a piece of land. And they discovered a natural resource, and now every year they are selling that resource and then paying the dividends, and it comes to something like in between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. So you can't really live off that, but you can see the benefits. And the strongest benefit is that people who would be means tested to death and said that you're getting this money to buy food and that's it, are using the money for the kinds of, I don't know, self-improvement or interventions that would give them a leg up later on, from accessing dental surgery, which even in our country is not covered by the NHS, but it gives a very poor impression where you go to an interview and you don't have a nice set of teeth, to getting some extra educational programs for your children. So any kind of disposable income is beneficial, and many arguments for universal basic income say that you should start with a small sum, get people accustomed to that, and maybe in time increase it. So this worry about how employers are going to act is I think a very legitimate one, but there are ways of running through the incentives that will help have a universal basic income in place that wouldn't create that big a problem and still would maintain some of the benefits. I don't know if I'll say something very quickly about the second intervention as well, which is that it's just a very good question, because I think if you look at the divides around how to respond to the pandemic, you will have, on the one side, the people who focus on individual freedom, and on the other side, the people who are focusing on altruistically impacting the lives of others. And then how to settle those two. As political philosophers, we all try to give arguments, one side or the other, but I don't think there's any conclusive one. I just think that the question by John Eliot is very good, because it latches on to a fundamental difference that can explain the political divides that we see.
Great. Okay, I think I was next in line. I wanted to talk to John Eliot's question as well, but I just wanted to say a little bit about your suggestion, Diana, as well at the start, because I just want to highlight this. I think the mental health benefits of UBI is just enormous. Just thinking of the many students I've been dealing with who are having major mental health problems, having to do their degrees on their own. It's been everyone knows it's been a mental health disaster, the pandemic. And I think it's worth thinking, I mean, I'm just repeating what you said really here, Diana, but it's worth thinking it's not just about the money, it's about also that sense that you have a right as a full member of society to some support, which is going to be monetary. It just seems to me it's a really strong mental health case for UBI, and I just wanted to stress that. Just mention it. But just to go to John's question, I couldn't see the question about education. I think my computer's gone funny, but there is this question about individualism and collectivism. I just wanted to say that I think, I mean, you're right that we've got. It's certainly not just a duty to yourself to wear a mask. It's a duty to others as well. You don't want to infect them. It's that it's all about. I mean, not the part of, I think, being in some sense small L liberal is to think that not every duty to others has to be imposed by the states. We can let people be nasty to each other to some extent. It depends on the degree of the harm caused. Some have to be, and we have to take stances on this. And as a democracy, that also means that some people's views are going to be imposed on others as the ones that the majority has decided that this is what we're going to force people to do, to respect other people. All of that seems correct to me, I think. Maybe I think it's often presented as a sort of a contrast between individualism and collectivism, but I think that can be sort of overdrawn. I think, in the sense that I think every individual, even if you're purely individualistic, you think it's all actually about helping individuals. Every individual has some major important interests in playing a full part in their group, in having the benefits of group interaction and these sorts of things. So I think often things that look like they have to be explained on collectivist grounds can still be ultimately justified in philosophical terms as there to serve each individual. So that was just one thing that struck me about your comment, but I think it's a good comment, and it brings out one of the challenges of the pandemic. So thanks.
Shall I try and draw this together? Just a few kind of concluding thoughts. So one of the kind of big themes coming out of the book, and that I think has also come out of this discussion, is the extent to which, even though COVID feels completely novel and unprecedented, how far a lot of the challenges that it raises, how far a lot of the things that we're talking about are longer running discussions, and where I think kind of the political philosophers we gathered to talk about this I think is in terms of taking the things they've been thinking about, the ideas had, the problems they've been grappling with, and seeing them in a slightly new light, but taking those tools and basically applying them. And so just in our discussion today, so Deanna's talked about risk and solidarity, and in a chapter she draws the analogy with World War II and the development of the welfare state. This is not fundamentally new and completely unfamiliar. Rowan's kind of discussion of legitimacy is like, it depends how you study political philosophy, but in many places it'll be week one is, how do we justify the state? Who do we need to justify it to? And it's just taking those thoughts and applying them. They feel newly relevant. The stuff we're talking about, the need for international solidarity and international institutions, again, a long-running theme that we've had basically since globalization, or certainly the most recent wave of globalization. And again, the stuff about intergenerational justice, which is, I think, it's only going to grow as a political policy kind of theme. But it's something that political philosophers have been starting to kind of get their arms around in probably the last 10, 20 years. So I think in many ways this seems like it's completely new, but there's fundamental continuities, and in some ways that's reassuring because we have some resources, but also it's a bit scary because it feels like these problems are not going to go away even if COVID is vanquished, because it's just tapping into things that were already there.
Thanks, Aveek. I cannot believe we've got through our time together already. Honestly, there's so much to think about. I think we're going to have to come back again next year, because we haven't touched on the Great Risk Transfer, which is a big report that Institute Faculty of Actuaries did, and we had an event on that earlier in the year. But I think the things that we've touched on today with COVID go far beyond that. And we've touched on climate change, but one of the recent events in the news last week was the lack of solidarity from fishermen when they were blocking an RNLI boat to go out and rescue people that were drowning. And we're almost heading for Christmas. It wasn't something I was expecting in the news, and it's made me think deeply about who do we have solidarity with? And I think that's a question that we can all take and think about over Christmas, which should be a happy time. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We've really enjoyed the discussion, but I think it is just the start of a conversation that we need to have much more deeply. So Aveek and your co-editor, thank you for soliciting the essays, if that's the right word, from the political philosophers that have really given us some meaty food for thought. It really is an easy read, so I definitely recommend reading it. Please do remember, those that are new to the David Hume Institute, we are a charity. We can only bring you these free events as a result of public donations, so please do not hesitate to get in touch if you would like to support us. And equally at the end, we do have a text to donate function that we're trialing in case anyone would like to donate on the spot, and we will put up the details in a second. So thank you very much, everyone. It's 1:30 on the dot, and I'm proud to bring it in on time again. So thank you very much. Have a very good festive season, everyone. I've really enjoyed the discussion today.